Welcome to this week's Walk Through Voices from Walk Through the Bible, where we are reading together with you through the Daily Walk Bible reading schedule. And our team from Walk Through is just sharing some of what we're seeing and reading and discovering as we are reading through the Bible with you this year. This week, we're reading Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and the first half of 1 Timothy. All of these books are letters that the Apostle Paul was writing to various groups of Christians or churches. Ephesians, for instance, was a letter that Paul was writing to the church at Ephesus. Earlier this year, I actually had the privilege of going to the ancient city of Ephesus. It's a remarkable place to visit. The ruins are actually very well preserved in the ancient city of Ephesus. And as you walk through the ancient city, you really get a sense of what it was like to live and to walk through this ancient city. Ephesus was an important city. It was on water, and so it was an important trade center throughout the entire Mediterranean region. It was a Greek city, and it was an important city even for the spread of Christianity. As Paul traveled to Ephesus and the church began to grow there, it was important for the spread of the gospel, but that was not without some resistance. Prominent in the religion in the city of Ephesus was the worship of this goddess named Artemis. In the 6th century BC, there was a temple of Artemis that was constructed. It was partially destroyed and rebuilt, and partially destroyed and rebuilt. And by the 1st century, this temple of Artemis was a massive structure. It was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, 50 to 60% bigger than the Parthenon. It was a huge structure and would have just been the center of religious life in the city of Ephesus. In fact, in Acts chapter 19, Paul goes to Ephesus and begins teaching and spreading the good news of Jesus Christ. And there's quite a disturbance because of that. There's a silversmith named Demetrius who made little silver shrines to be used in the worship of Artemis in the temple of Artemis there in Ephesus. And you can imagine that if Paul shows up and says, well, there's only one true God and it's not Artemis, his business of selling shrines for worship is going to be hurt pretty significantly. And so there's all sorts of tension and a disturbance. And in fact, in Acts chapter 19, verse 34, we're told that the people get so furious with Paul, for 2 hours they shouted in unison, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." For 2 hours they shouted that. When we were in Ephesus, we went to the ancient site of the temple of Artemis. Here's a picture of the ruins. Well, there's not much there, is there? There's some pieces of the foundation. There's one lone column that's left. There would have been columns that surrounded the entire structure. There's one column left, barely standing. I mean, this was once one of the most impressive feats of civil engineering. And here, the ruins themselves aren't even all that impressive. It's mostly just a grass field with some few blocks of concrete and not a lot left. Something struck me as I was reading Ephesians this week again. I got to Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19, and Paul writes this to the Ephesian Christians. "Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and aliens, but fellow citizens with God's people and members of God's household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. In him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him, you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit." I mean, just imagine if you were an Ephesian Christian hearing these words from the Apostle Paul. Your entire life would have likely been lived in the shadow of this impressive, massive temple to a pagan god named Artemis. And here Paul is writing and says, no. God doesn't live in some temple made of concrete and stone where people go to worship. No, rather based off of the foundation of the apostles and prophets with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. The building is built together, and you are the place, the temple in which God lives. What a dramatic shift in your mind that must have been. Imagine you were a Jewish Christian hearing these words from the Apostle Paul, who for your entire Jewish life believed that God lived in the temple in Jerusalem up on the top of Mount Zion. And then you hear these words and you go, well, God doesn't live in that structure made of brick and stone. No, God dwells among the lives of those who follow Jesus Christ as Lord. What a contrast, what a shift. And then I read these words and I think of the contrast between the temple that would have been familiar to the Ephesian Christians and the temple that God is building. It is a striking contrast. When you look at a picture, or you visit a site, and that temple that the Ephesian Christians would have been familiar with, it's just rubbish. And the temple that God is building through the church, it will last forever. The temple that the Ephesian Christians would have known, it was built on a bunch of false hopes with a pagan God. And God is building a temple on the truth of His Word. One is just an interesting place to visit and maybe snap a photo. And this temple, it's changing the world. And that contrast between what the Ephesians would have been familiar with and what we read about in Ephesians chapter 2, that contrast helps me to ask, or forces me or challenges me to ask a really important question. What are we building our lives on? Are we building our lives on what society tells us is good and important and values that one day will just be nothing more than some forgotten ruins? Or are we building our lives on that which is of eternal significance and will never fail? And that decision on what foundation we're building our lives on and the temple that we're choosing to live and worship, that decision makes all the difference. See you soon.